Strange happenings in the house. Peppa wakes up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, like faint whimpering. She gets out of bed and notices that her toy dinosaur is missing. George is awake too and says he had a strange dream about someone standing in the corner of his room watching him. Peppa goes to her parents' room but finds it empty. The windows in the house are shut tight, and outside there's nothing but thick gray fog. Where is everyone? Why is it so quiet? George asks. The TV suddenly turns on by itself, and a deep, inhuman voice says, "You've been happy for too long. It's time to pay for it." The house begins to change. Dust covers the floors, cracks appear on the walls, and the mirror in the bathroom becomes cloudy. When Peppa looks into it, she doesn't see her reflection, but something that looks like her, with empty eyes and a sinister smile. George starts to panic and suddenly vanishes into the dark hallway. Peppa hears him scream but can't find him. Instead, she discovers his toy dinosaur, now covered in dirt. Peppa Pig, George's transformation. The episode begins like any normal day. Peppa and George are playing in the garden when George trips and falls into a small bush with sharp branches. He scratches his hand. Mummy Pig bandages it and says, "It's just a little scratch, George. Nothing to worry about." But George becomes unusually quiet and there's a strange gleam in his eyes. George's strange behavior. The next day, George refuses to eat his favorite chocolate cake. Instead, he sits at the table staring at Peppa as if he doesn't recognize her. In a quiet, raspy voice, he says, "I don't like the light. It's too bright." That evening, Peppa notices that the bandage on George's hand is soaked with a strange dark liquid resembling black ink. When Mummy Pig tries to rebandage it, George jerks his hand away and runs upstairs. Strange noises, like something breaking, come from his room. Later, Peppa sneaks into George's room and finds him sitting in the corner. His skin looks pale, his eyes unnaturally wide, and something is moving under his shirt on his back. The next day, Daddy Pig comments that George smells odd, like damp earth. Mummy Pig starts to panic, but George suddenly shouts, "I'm not George anymore, you can't stop me." That evening, George disappears. Peppa finds him in the garden, digging into the soil with what now looks like clawed hands. She asks, "George, what are you doing?" He turns, and Peppa sees thin, dark wings beginning to grow from his back. His voice no longer sounds like George's. "I will soon be whole. You're in my way." Peppa calls for Mummy and Daddy, but they don't arrive in time. George spreads his wings and disappears into the night. All that's left behind is his toy dinosaur, now covered in black slime. A few days pass and the family tries to return to normal life, but Peppa notices someone tapping on her bedroom window every night. One night she wakes up and sees a figure outside. It's George, but he no longer looks like her brother. His eyes glow yellow and large, sharp wings stretch behind him. He whispers, "You're next, Peppa." Peppa Pig, the new friend. One rainy day, Peppa was sitting at home feeling bored. All her friends were busy and she had no one to play with. "Why don't you find something new to do?" Mummy Pig suggested, handing Peppa an old box of toys she had found in the attic. Peppa opened the box and discovered a strange doll. It was dusty, with worn-out clothes and a slightly cracked face, but its eyes looked almost real. "What an unusual doll," Peppa said, picking it up. From that moment, strange things began to happen. Later that evening, Peppa was playing with her new doll, which she had named Betsy. She told it stories just as she would with her friends. "You're my best friend," Peppa said with a smile. But when she put the doll down on the floor, she noticed that its head had turned as if it were looking straight at her. "It's just the wind," Peppa muttered, even though the windows were closed. The next day, Peppa wanted to take Betsy on a walk, but when Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig saw the doll, they reacted strangely. "Where did you find that?" Daddy Pig asked, his voice trembling. In the box from the attic, Peppa replied. Mummy and Daddy exchanged nervous glances but said nothing more. During the walk, Betsy accidentally fell into the mud. Peppa tried to pick her up, but the doll felt heavier than before. When she lifted it, she noticed that the mud on the doll seemed to move, almost alive. "You're so weird," Peppa said, but still brought the doll back home. That night, Peppa heard whispering. "Peppa, come to me." She woke up and saw that Betsy was sitting right by her bed, even though Peppa was sure she had left the doll in another room. "This is just a dream. Just a dream," Peppa said, pulling the blanket over her head. But then she heard something whisper directly into her ear. "I'm always here." Peppa decided to tell her parents, but when she showed them the doll, Mummy and Daddy Pig suddenly said they couldn't see anything. "Peppa, you must be imagining things." "There's nothing there," Daddy Pig said. "But she's right here. Don't you see her?" Peppa cried. Each day, the doll grew stranger. Peppa could feel Betsy watching her, even when she wasn't looking. Toys in the room began moving on their own, and one day Peppa found a message written on the mirror. "We're best friends. Forever." Final scene. The final shot shows Peppa sitting in her room with Betsy. Her eyes are empty, and a wide, unnatural smile is frozen on her face. Behind her, the shadow of the doll looms large and distorted on the wall. A whisper echoes in the background. "Now you're mine forever." Peppa Pig. Mummy has changed. One morning, Peppa noticed that Mummy Pig looked a bit strange. Her face was paler than usual, and her eyes seemed dark and tired. "Mummy, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Of course, darling," Mummy Pig replied, smiling, but her smile looked wrong, too stretched, and there was no warmth in it. Throughout the day, Mummy Pig stopped doing her usual activities. She didn't make lunch, didn't tidy the house, and barely spoke to Daddy Pig. Instead, she just sat by the window, staring into the distance as if waiting for something. Later, Peppa noticed that Mummy Pig had started making strange sounds, quiet whispers, as if she were talking to someone invisible. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange noise and saw Mummy standing in the hallway. The moonlight lit her figure, and Peppa noticed that her mother's body had changed. Her shadow on the wall was longer and distorted, and her fingers looked too long and thin. "Mummy?" Peppa called softly. Mummy Pig slowly turned, her eyes glowing faintly. "Go back to bed, Peppa," she said in a voice that was hollow and unfamiliar. The next day, Mummy Pig barely spoke. She stopped responding to questions and kept whispering to herself. Daddy Pig tried to talk to her, but she just ignored him. Peppa began to notice that Mummy's face was becoming distorted. Her skin looked gray, and her eyes resembled empty black holes. "Daddy, something's wrong with Mummy," Peppa whispered. But Daddy Pig just sighed. "She's just tired." That night, Peppa woke up again. She heard Mummy Pig wandering around the house. Peppa quietly left her room and saw Mummy standing in front of the mirror in the living room. But the reflection in the mirror wasn't normal. Instead of Mummy Pig, there was a tall figure with long arms and eyes glowing with a sickly green light. The figure slowly turned toward Peppa, even though Mummy stood perfectly still. "You'll be like me soon," a whisper echoed from the mirror. Peppa ran to George's room and woke him up. "We need to run away. Mummy is different," she whispered. They tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked. When they looked out the window, the garden was gone. Outside was nothing but endless darkness. Suddenly, Mummy Pig appeared behind them. Her face was completely distorted, her eyes glowing, and her mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide grin. "Where are you going, my little ones?" she whispered, stepping closer. Final scene. Peppa and George hide in the corner of their room, trembling with fear. Mummy Pig slowly approaches, her shadow stretching across the walls, filling the entire room. The final shot shows her face getting closer to the camera, her glowing eyes staring straight ahead.